written questions. In none of these cases was a matter found to be a prima facie breach of privilege. Le Président Regan.
Speaker Regan, in addressing a similar complaint on September 27, 2016, which can be found at page 5175 of the debates, put it succinctly in stating, and I quote, "It has been long established and accepted that the role of the Speaker in such circumstances is tightly prescribed and limited," unquote.
I repeat these words because the Chair does not have the discretion to become some sort of arbiter as to the quality or accuracy of responses to a written question. As such, I cannot find a prima facie question of privilege. However, as noted by many other Chair occupants, given the repeated complaints of members, it would perhaps be beneficial to re-evaluate the rules and processes surrounding responses to order paper questions. This being underlined, the Chair notes that in 2004, the Auditor General was asked to review the process as it was at the time and provided a certain number of recommendations to the government. It may be time to undertake a similar exercise to ensure that members can obtain the information that we require to do our jobs. I'm sure that we can all agree as parliamentarians that members are right to expect the government to answer questions as fulsome a manner as possible. Je remercie les députés.
I thank all members for their attention.
Orders of the day, ordre du jour, government orders, government bills, commons, consideration at report stage of Bill C-20, Public Complaints and Review Commission Act.
So this part first? Yes. Good. There is one motion in amending standing on the notice paper for the report stage of Bill C-20. Motion number 1 will be debated and voted upon. Je vais maintenant soumettre la motion.
I will now put motion number 1 to the House. Mr. Lloyd, seconded by Mr. Telney, moves.
By deleting the short title. Debate. The Honourable Member for Sturgeon River Parkland.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise and lead off debate today on Liberal Bill C-20. This bill seeks to create an independent commission for the RCMP and for the CBSA to address complaints that the public may have on their treatment. Now, the Liberal government has been talking about the importance of getting this legislation passed for quite some time, and I find it curious that in previous parliaments, this similar legislation has died in 2 previous parliaments. And so we're certainly hoping to see that this legislation comes through in this parliament because it's been far too long that this legislation has been allowed.
I have a point of order from the Honourable Member for New Westminster Burnaby.
So why did the Conservatives move a dilatory motion to delay the legislation?
That's a point of debate. The Honourable Member of Sturgeon River Parkland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll continue on with my remarks. It's vitally important that we debate this legislation. Coming out of committee, there were numerous concerns that we as Conservatives raised that were not addressed in the amendments to this legislation. Certainly it's not enough to impede the legislation, but I think it's critically important that we do have a debate on this and see it come through. I find it curious, though, that the NDP Liberal government, who told us last fall how important it was to get this legislation passed, has dithered. This legislation came out of committee in November, and we've had months to bring forward this legislation for third reading debate. We're now here in May, and this government has finally brought this forward. So we don't take it very seriously when this NDP Liberal government talks about how important they consider this legislation when they're only bringing it up in May. Our RCMP and CBSA officers do make incredible sacrifices, and we need to do the very best that we can to ensure that they and their families are safe and protected, and because they're consistently putting their lives in danger every day. And it is in the interests of the public and our brave members of the RCMP and CBSA that complaints be dealt with in a timely and efficient manner. And this is crucial to guard against potential abuses of power and maintain the trust that Canadians have in their agencies. Canada has the largest undefended border in the world, and the lack of resources for the CBSA to perform their role to the fullest extent is seen in the rise in crime in cities such as Montreal and Toronto and across the country, where illegal firearms are being smuggled through our porous border and used every day in horrific crimes. Even in rural areas, including in my riding, in towns such as Bonaccord, crime is on the rise. Before after 9 years of this NDP Liberal government's soft on crime policies. And unfortunately, it seems that this government is more focused on targeting law-abiding Canadian firearm owners and hunters rather than fulfilling promises to implement a policy and provide resources for our border where illegal activities such as auto theft and gun smuggling is rampant, to the point where our fastest growing export in this country is stolen vehicles. Now, Public Safety Committee, we heard the Liberals continually attempt to distract from their miserable record on crime. And amidst this ongoing auto theft crisis that's impacting communities across the country, desperate Liberals have resorted to blaming car dealerships, small businesses, for the rise in car thefts. It's clear they don't want to talk about the facts. And the fact is that auto theft has risen to unprecedented levels as a direct result of this Liberal soft on crime agenda. Now, Mr. Speaker, we can all agree that this bill is important to maintain public trust in the RCMP and the CBSA. However, we can't have productive debates unless we discuss the tremendous strain that is currently being placed on our brave men and women. Our law enforcement agencies, much like the Canadian Armed Forces, is suffering from significant recruitment and retention issues. And I would ask the government, what exactly are they doing to ensure that these brave men and women feel valued and supported in their role? And of course, the public should have a right of an independent and effective complaints commission to hold the RCMP and CBSA accountable for their actions. But when we're not providing the resources to frontline police officers and CBSA and other first responders to do their job effectively, it's no surprise that we're seeing mistakes. Our law enforcement personnel are under tremendous pressure as they deal with the impacts of the crime wave that's occurring across this country. And when mistakes happen in the line of duty, it's frequently because these exemplary men and women are being pushed to their limit, overwhelmed by the crisis this government has created. And in fact, the National Police Federation put forward very common sense amendments that they wanted to see in this motion. They're concerned because RCMP officers are often being pulled off the front lines to do bureaucratic paperwork and deal with complaints when it should really be dealt with by an independent commission. Unfortunately, this bill has some flaws because it still maintains a requirement for extensive bureaucratic red tape for RCMP officers in providing information and supporting these investigations, which is pulling our resources off the front. We want to see an independent commission that does its job. We want to see an independent commission that is resourced and staffed so that RCMP officers can focus on the front lines, so CBSA officers can focus on the front lines and not the back lines. Now, let's talk about drug use. Our law enforcement officers are expected to act as social workers. They're confronting daily crime and disorder that this government's drug policies have inflicted on our communities. And we know that this is causing a mental health crisis within the ranks. And violent crime. We have heard at Public Safety Committee that the chiefs are fearful for the safety of their officers, especially since violent offenders are able to continuously terrify communities as a result of the bail, not jail provisions of Liberal Bill C-75. And it should come as no surprise that the government doesn't want to have conversations like this. Their record on crime is miserable. And since this government came to power in 2015, Canada has become a massive importer of illegal firearms from the United States and a massive exporter of stolen cars to Africa and the Middle East, and also an exporter of fentanyl across the world. It's shameful. Now, while implementing this soft on crime agenda, this government has taken very little action to ensure that the brave men and women who choose to serve their communities and their country feel supported and respected in their work. Now, everyone who goes through a border crossing should be able to go without facing discrimination or unfair treatment by border agents. Now, C-20 would allow people who have negative experiences, who feel that their rights have been violated, to submit complaints formally and have them reviewed within a 6-month period. And I think it's critically important that we talk about this 6-month period because we've seen some cases that witnesses brought forward where people made complaints to the commission or made complaints, and these complaints were unaddressed for months and months and months. In fact, years where some complaints were not addressed. And in fact, in some tragic cases, the complainants actually passed away before they could get a response to their complaint. And we don't want to see that happen. Of course, sometimes it's unavoidable, but we need to set standards to ensure that these complaints are being dealt with in a timely manner. Now, currently, CBSA is the only public safety agency in Canada without any independent oversight body for public complaints. Now, establishing an independent review body will foster enhanced public trust and confidence in Canada's law enforcement and border services institution. And I think that's something that we can agree is desperately needed in this country. Now, in closing, Mr. Speaker, we know that this NDP Liberal government has ignored their promises and put off this critical legislation for years. They failed to deliver this important change, although we hope that this change will soon be delivered, that would help Canadians in renewing their trust in our public safety agencies, a trust that I know many Canadians have, but when they see things like these Police Complaints Commission not operating effectively or not being in existence in some cases, I think it causes some people to have some doubts about the transparency and accountability in the system. Now, how is it that so many Canadians have had to face nothing but endless bureaucracy when for years we could have had legislation and a system to streamline this process for public complaints and establish an oversight body for the CBSA? This government has had plenty of opportunities to deliver and fulfill their promises over these last 9 years, but they failed to do so. If we've proven anything to Canadians, it's that the promises of this NDP Liberal government are just empty words, and years go by before any meaningful action or promise can be accomplished, if at all. Now, to perform their jobs effectively and deliver the best possible service to Canadians, the RCMP and CBSA require an efficient complaints process. And while common sense Conservatives are supportive of this effort, we believe that Liberal government needs to do more to support our brave men and women in uniform who support our communities. My Conservative colleagues and I will continue to advocate on behalf of Canadians and ensure the highest standards are being met within the CBSA and RCMP. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, it really and truly is amazing. On the one hand, the Conservative Party is trying to blame the government for not advancing the legislation. And then on the other hand, it is the Conservative Party that's preventing the passage of the legislation. It's truly amazing how the member can stand in his place and be critical of us because of their behavior, Mr. Speaker. Take a look at what it is that the member is actually debating today. Today we're debating a motion to prevent the bill from passing because they want to delete the short title of the legislation. It's Conservative filibuster. So on the one hand, you can't criticize the government for not passing the legislation when you are the problem. The Conservative Party and the leadership of the Conservative Party do not want the legislation to pass. Does the member not see the hypocrisy in that?
The Honourable Member for Sturgeon River Parkland. Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. And time again, this is what this NDP Liberal government does. They hold their legislation until the last possible minute, and then they tell Parliament that we can't have a debate on this legislation. And if you do want to have a debate on this legislation, then you're filibustering this legislation. We can't have that. In order to effectively represent the will of the Canadian people, in order to be effective parliamentarians, we need to have opportunities to debate this legislation. This Liberal government has allowed this legislation to die in the order paper in 2 parliaments, and they allowed this legislation, which passed in committee in November of last year, to sit on the order paper and not come until debate until May of this year. It's clear that this government is not taking this seriously. They don't want to have real debates in this House. They just want to railroad their legislation through, and us as common sense Conservative will not allow that to happen. We will stand up for our Westminster system of parliamentary democracy. We will stand up for robust debate in this House, and we will never apologize for that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question et commentaire. Questions and comments. L'honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Les Verchères. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to be able to participate in the debate here. I'm just trying to hear. I'm not sure if they can hear me. Thank you. So my question for my colleague is, we're debating C20 here, and it's interesting. I know my colleague opposite, everyone's saying that they're going to vote in favor of this, my colleagues to the left. So I think everyone's in favor of this bill. So perhaps instead of dealing with the specifics of C20, I'd like to talk about something related to C20, and that is the way this government is managing the borders and customs and so on. I wonder, in general, beyond C20, whether my colleague is satisfied with the government's management at the borders. The Honourable Member for Sturgeon River.
Colleague, for that excellent question. We just had shocking testimony at Public Safety Committee recently that the CBSA has not scanned any containers leaving the port of Halifax. We know that Canada's ports have become a haven for organized crime shipping stolen Canadian property, primarily Canadian vehicles, but also drugs that are being manufactured in Canada all across the world. And the fact that this government has not given the appropriate resources to law enforcement and to the CBSA to do their job effectively, to protect Canadians' property, to keep our country from becoming a haven for organized crime, it's unacceptable. And there's no excuse from this government. They've had 9 years to fix this problem. It's risen by over 100%. Car thefts are up over 100% since 2015 under this NDP Liberal government. It's unacceptable, and we're definitely not satisfied, and we're going to fight to make sure that we fix our borders. We need to secure our borders to prevent Canadians' property from being exported abroad. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member New Westminster Burnaby.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. I like the member, working with him on public safety, but seriously, the CBSA cuts were under the Conservative government. So yes, the Liberals haven't fixed what Conservatives broke, but Conservatives broke it in the first place. Now, the reality is, we saw repeatedly in public safety, Conservatives filibustering this bill for months and months and months. Every time we showed up at public safety to actually go through the bill, we ended up going through some motion, another dilatory motion that was raised by Conservative members of the committee. Now, reality is, what we are debating today is the deletion of the short title, the cost to taxpayers of the hours of debate around this Conservative fringe motion that is only in place to delay this legislation is going to be tens of thousands of dollars, and we don't get to third reading debate, which I would agree. It would be an important debate to have. So will the Conservatives withdraw this dilatory motion to delete the short title so we can vote on report stage and move on to third reading?
The Honourable Member for Sturgeon River Parkland.
Thank you. And I did enjoy working with the member on committee as well. There are definitely opportunities for collaboration. I'm a collaborative kind of MP, but this is part and parcel of what we've seen from this NDP Liberal government. We have an NDP party that's more aggressive about passing government legislation without proper review and debate than this government is. And this NDP Liberal government just wants to railroad things through. And we have to remember what happened last fall, is that Canadians wanted answers about Paul Bernardo's transfer from a maximum to a medium security prison. And this NDP Liberal government refused to allow Canadians to get those answers. We as Conservatives we were open to even having one meeting on this, but instead it was this Liberal NDP government that were desperate to cover this up, desperate not to have a conversation, and they kept this committee dragged out for months and months so that C-20 was delayed until November. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I have to make a comment before we start. We go to the next speaker. But I always hope Friday that people are tired and they keep their comments short and the questions short, so everybody can participate in it. Just a reminder that we try to keep going so that we can keep everybody gets an opportunity to ask questions and comments during this, because I know I want everyone to have an opportunity to participate. Continuing debate, the Honourable Member for Nepean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to start by recognizing and thanking the men and women serving at RCMP and CBSA. Today, we stand at an important moment in the evolution of Canada's approach to law enforcement and border security. With the introduction of Bill C-20, we commit to enhancing transparency, accountability, and public trust in our institutions. The creation of Public Complaints and Review Commission, PCRC, marks a significant advancement in our continuous pursuit of a fair and just society. Let us begin by acknowledging that the essence of law enforcement and border security relies not only on the enforcement of laws, but on public's trust. Trust is hard-earned and easily lost. Public trust in law enforcement agency is fundamental to the stability and effectiveness of legal systems worldwide. It ensures that citizens respect, obey, and support the enforcement of laws, which is critical for maintaining public order and security. When the public trusts the police and other law enforcement bodies, they are more likely to cooperate with investigations, report crimes, and adhere to legal directives, fostering a safer community for everyone. Trust between public and law enforcement also reinforces the legitimacy of the police in the eyes of the community. This legitimacy is crucial as it underpins the public's compliance with laws without the need for coercion. People comply because they believe it is the right thing to do, not just out of fear of punishment. Moreover, high levels of trust in law enforcement correlate strongly with lower crime rates. Communities where trust is prevalent tend to have more positive interactions with police, which helps in effective policing and less violent confrontations. Furthermore, trust in law enforcement is essential for upholding the principles of a civilized society where justice is seen to be done and is carried out fairly. A lack of trust can lead to a breakdown in civil order, increase in crime, and potential for civil unrest. Trust ensures a collaborative relationship between the community and the police, which is vital for developing strategies that effectively address local crime and safety concerns. To maintain this trust, law enforcement agencies must operate transparently and accountably, demonstrating their commitment to justice and fairness in all their actions. The establishment of independent bodies that can oversee, review, and investigate law enforcement practices, such as complaints against police conduct, also play a pivotal role. These measures not only help to prevent abuses of power, but also ensure that the public's concerns are heard and addressed, thus maintaining the essential trust needed for a harmonious and civilized society. In recent years, public trust in Canadian law enforcement agency has experienced a noticeable decline. This trend has been influenced by several high-profile incidents involving police misconduct and the broader discussions around systemic racism within law enforcement. These factors have catalyzed public scrutiny and skepticism, promoting calls for greater transparency and accountability. Restoring public confidence remains a significant challenge and an ongoing priority for Canadian authorities. The current status and trends in American law enforcement can influence Canadian attitudes towards our own police forces. The global nature of media and the internet means that Canadians are often exposed to prominent news stories and discussions about the American police practices, especially concerning issues of police brutality, systemic racism, and accountability. High-profile incidents in the United States, such as killing of George Floyd, has sparked international movements like Black Lives Matter, which also resonate strongly in Canada. This exposure can impact how Canadians perceive our own police services, leading to increased calls for transparency, reform, and accountability within Canadian law enforcement agencies. Even though policing practices and the legal framework in Canada are distinct from those in the US, the widespread media coverage and societal reactions to American law enforcement issues can heighten public awareness and skepticism in Canada as well. Moreover, similar underlying issues such as racial profiling and the treatment of indigenous peoples and minorities are present in both countries, further aligning public concerns. As a result, the debates and reforms happening in the US often act as catalysts for similar discussions and changes in Canadian policing and public policy. The Public Complaints and Review Commission, PCRC, proposed under this bill will extend its oversight to the Canadian Border Service Agency as well, addressing a long-standing gap in our law enforcement framework. For the first time, both these critical agencies, that is RCMP and CBSA, will be under the same umbrella of independent scrutiny. The government plans to invest $112 million to support the operations of the PCRC. This substantial financial commitment underscores our dedication to building a robust mechanism that will serve Canadians long into the future. One of the key features of PCRC will be its enhanced accountability measures. We are introducing codified timelines requiring the RCMP Commissioner and the CBSA President to respond to the PCRC's interim reports, reviews, and recommendations within specified periods. This will address concerns about delays in responding to oversight findings and ensures that actions are timely and transparent. Moreover, the PCRC will play a crucial role in addressing systematic racism within our law enforcement agencies. The PCRC will also have a public education mandate. It will not only oversee and review, but also inform and educate the public about the rights and the mechanisms available for redress. Knowledge is power, and empowering our citizens is a crucial step towards a more engaged and informed community. Another significant aspect of the PCRC will be its responsibilities in handling serious incidents involving CBSA personnel. This includes the ability to send observers to ensure that internal investigations are conducted impartially. This measure will enhance the credibility of investigative processes and increase public confidence in the outcomes. Furthermore, the PCRC will operate independently but not in isolation. It will maintain a collaborative relationship with National Security and Intelligence Review Agency to ensure that national security-related complaints are handled with the requisite expertise and confidentiality. This legislation is about more than just oversight. It is about reaffirming our commitment to the principles of justice and equity that Canada holds dear. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable member for Calgary Forest Lawn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since the member brought up the word racism, it makes me think about some of the things that have transpired under their government after 9 years. We've seen more racism than ever all across the departments under 9 years of their government, including in the Immigration Department, where there was a report that came out in 2021, a Polaris report, that showed that racism only went up. And since on that topic, I'd like to get the member's take on the Prime Minister and someone who's done racist blackface, what his thoughts are on that, and the rise in racism under their government in all departments.
Member for Nepean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I fully disagree that racism went up during the last 9 years in our government. Mr. Speaker, what has happened is the recognition that there is systemic racism, which resulted in more number of complaints that have been made public. That has gone up, and that is the reason why we see the increase in the statistics.
Question et commentaire. Questions and comments. The honourable member New Westminster Burnaby.
I always appreciate hearing comments from my colleague. And the reality is, despite the Conservatives fighting tooth and nail to block this legislation, we're finally getting it through. The problem is, as you know, Mr. Speaker, the government hasn't adequately funded the Commission and the work that needs to be done so that these complaints can be done in a timely fashion. This has been an ongoing problem. Repeatedly at Public Safety Committee, witnesses came forward to talk about the lack of resources the government has put in. We've heard from a wide variety of witnesses that wanted to have a functional commission that did an adequate job. It's not going to be possible if this government doesn't adequately fund it. So my question to my colleague is quite simple. Why won't the Liberal government adequately fund this commission so it can do the important work that it needs to do?
The honourable member for Nepean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Government has indeed made adequate funding provisions for this public complaints and review commission. I think we are committed about $112 million for this. This substantial financial commitment underscores our dedication to building a robust mechanism that will serve Canadians long into the future.
Questions and comments? Questions, commentaires? L'honorable député de Pierre Boucher, les Patriotes.
The Honourable Member for Pierre Boucher, les Patriotes Verchères. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A question for my colleague across the way. The colleague seems very proud of his government's accomplishments and track record. Now, when it comes to this bill, C-20, there's a lot of mention of customs officers and the work that they do. In committee, during testimony, we heard about excessive work. Customs officers have too much work, and we all remember times when we have been in line for a very long time at the airport trying to get through customs. But sometimes when employees are very tired, when they're overworked, they can possibly make mistakes. So here's my question for my colleague. Does he feel that the lack of resources offered to customs officers can perhaps have contributed to them making mistakes? If his government were to fund them adequately and give them the resources they need, would there be fewer problems, and would we not even need C-20?
I thank the member for his question. Obviously, the workplace conditions, the working conditions of all the men and women in uniform should be improved as and when required. He mentioned the delays at the airport, but at the same time, we too have seen that this process of going through the airport has been quite smoother. Obviously, from time to time, depending on the season, depending on the particular day, there might be some overwhelming workload, and the conditions has to be improved.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Châteauguay-Lacoste.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. I greatly appreciated the comments of my colleague regarding the empowerment of citizens to address complaints, to forward their complaints through this process. I'd like to know his thoughts on how this complaint process will help the RCMP and the CBSA actually better manage their affairs as well.
20 seconds to go. The honourable member for Nepean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a very important thing. The more complaints are handled in a transparent way, the agencies, the officers, the executives there, they feel accountable, and that is how it going to help. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Reprise du débat. L'honorable député de Pierre Boucher.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Pierre Boucher, les Patriotes Verchères. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Today, we are debating C-20 to modify how complaints which are filed are handled. Complaints, of course, about poor service offered by customs agents and the mistakes they may have made. I'm happy to have the opportunity to rise for a second time this week in this place, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this week, I had the opportunity to speak to the government's latest budget. I would like to talk about the government's budget, and that will lead me into my comments about C-20. The government tabled its budget, this Liberal government, of course, and it's a historic budget. Why? Well, because never before has there been such a historic, monumental lack of respect for the areas of jurisdiction of the provinces. This government doesn't seem interested in what's under its jurisdiction. It's rather interested in the jurisdiction of others. And the Prime Minister is acting like a king. He may be following his monarchy-related beliefs. But when it comes to C-20, I must, on the contrary, commend the Prime Minister. That might surprise some. The Bloc isn't here to condemn all government legislation. We commend them on legislation that is positive, and that's what I'm doing now. Now, once in a while, there can be exceptions to the rule, and this legislation is an exception. That is, this is an exception because the Liberal government is doing its job, minding its business and its jurisdiction. Not bad. We like it. We'd, in fact, like this to occur more often. I must admit that if this happened more often, if the Liberal government handled its jurisdiction, then things might go better in Canada. Now, what is C-20 all about? C-20, well, the average Canadian, right? the average Canadian, we have sometimes had to go abroad to travel to another country. And when we travel to another country, we encounter customs officers who ask us questions. Where will you be going? How long will you be staying? What is the reason for your travel? Customs officers, their responsibility is to protect national security, to determine whether visitors arrive with good intentions, whether they are in fact authorized to enter the country or not, and whether the traveler's visit will be positive or neutral for the country, or whether it might in fact be dangerous or negative for the country. Customs agents do incredibly important work, and that's why we grant them extraordinary powers.
Bagages où ils n'ont pas besoin de mandat pour nous mettre de côté.
They don't need a warrant to search through our luggage or to hold you longer at the border. They have remarkable powers. They may intimidate some. When you find yourselves at customs, you often start to worry whether you've done something wrong, whether perhaps you have something wrong in your luggage. You start wondering, well, maybe in the country I'm in, there's something I didn't know about, some rule. You often feel a bit nervous. And it's the same way for people who come here. And then there's an additional issue. Often people coming to Canada are not familiar with what they could seek out to help them if there's any abuse against them. So people may feel very intimidated when they see the customs officer's authority. Of course, it's ultimately excellent that they have this authority because it can protect us from people or objects that they're transporting that could reduce overall societal well-being. We don't want people coming through customs and then later realize that they were members of organized crime who are coming here for a hit, or foreign agents who, for whatever reason, are coming here to commit acts of undue influence, or people who are smuggling drugs. For all of these reasons, it's very important to give the customs officers the resources they need to do their work. But in some cases, they will abuse their powers. And we hope, of course, that will happen as rarely as possible. But ultimately, we know that there are places in the world where perhaps rules are a little less stringent than they are here, and where when you go to customs, you can almost expect abuses to be committed. Of course, that's not what we want for this country. We're in a G7 country, a country that theoretically respects people's rights, with the Constitution, with the rights that were enshrined by the father of the current Prime Minister. We may not agree with all of the parts of that, but ultimately there are rights. And we hope that people who are applying our legislation are going to apply it appropriately. And we also hope, by the way, just to say this by the way, but I hope that this government will respect its own constitution and not get involved where it's not supposed to. But in any case, coming back to customs officers, they are representatives of the government, and their behavior should be impeccable. Now, when people face inconveniences at customs, when they go through their luggage, they take everything out, of course, it means that it's an invasion of privacy. The customs agents are going to see whether you do your laundry regularly, what you've been wearing. Of course, it causes discomfort. We hope that this kind of thing will always respect people's privacy and dignity. It's the same thing, say, with a strip search. A customs officer could decide to do a strip search. They might even see whether you've hidden forbidden substances within your body. They might inspect your genitals. And you wouldn't want the customs officer to start making remarks like, I'm not sure you showered yesterday. Or, I don't find you very attractive. Or comments on people's height or weight or color. That would all be completely inappropriate at a time when the individual is in a vulnerable situation. And that's why we're hoping that C20 will ultimately become law. We know that customs officers have rights, and they need to make sure that our legislation is applied. But we also need to ensure that these powers are appropriately limited. Now, previously, people could table complaints. That was a method that existed, but when you made a complaint, often these complaints were dealt with internally. There was a lack of transparency. There was a sense that there could be institutional bias. For example, in my writing, people often complain about noise and the speed of trains, but when they lodge a complaint, it's actually to the police who are from the same company. So they complain to CN's police service, but then they're complaining against the CN as well. So there's a real sense that there's institutional bias. And with C20, we're trying to ensure that an arm's length organization will be responsible for settling complaints. If people want to go directly to the arm's length organization, they can do so, or they can do things the old way. They can go to customs and see if the complaint is handled internally or not, and then later, if it hasn't been dealt with, go to the arm's length organization, where it would be dealt with by civilians, not former CBSA officers or RCMP officers. We see that. We see that with a name change, this arm's length organization, which already handles RCMP complaints, could handle complaints having to do with the CBSA. In conclusion, I would say that I think this is constructive. It will strengthen the public's trust in our system. But we also need to ensure that customs officers who do very important work, that they get the resources they need. Because, of course, that doesn't excuse everything, but sometimes when you're tired, you can make mistakes. Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Châteauguay-Lacolle. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciated my colleague's speech. And I'm glad that he recognizes that sometimes here in the federal government, we can do things right. I listened closely to what he said about how it can be difficult for customs officers and RCMP officers to do their work, and that it's very demanding. So my question, does my colleague agree that what we really need is diversity within the staffing of both organizations to better serve citizens? The Honourable Member for Pierre-Boucher-les-Patriotes-Verchères. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the question takes me aback a little bit because I tend to take for granted that any customs officer does their job professionally, regardless of their religion or the color of their skin. So the idea of forcing customs officers to have more diversity, I don't know whether that will really lead to change. The idea that a customs officer might be more professional or less based on their ethnic origin or their language, I hope that's not what my colleague is suggesting. The Honourable Member for Bruce Grey Owen Sound. Bill C-20 is clearly important to bring trust and accountability to the RCMP and the CBSA. Unfortunately, this liberal government always seems to be reducing attention to accountability. For example, when it comes to the NCCOB Act, a review was supposed to start in fall 2022, but the government refused to start that accountability process. Why does my colleague think that the Liberal government is reticent to give priority to accountability legislation? The Honourable Member for Pierre-Boucher-les Patriotes Verchères. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to congratulate my colleague on his French. It's always really nice to see people from other Canadian provinces who, as a sign of respect for others and perhaps out of personal interest, that they will learn the language of people who are, for now, part of our country, part of my country. And of course, many Quebecers speak very good English. Many Francophones learn English, and not so often Anglophones who learn French. So, in answering my colleague's question, I must say that I'm not surprised at his question about this government's reticence to do its work. It's what I said in my speech, too. This government very rarely shows any interest in its own work. It tends to spend more energy on what doesn't actually have anything to do with its business, like areas of Quebec jurisdiction. It likes to preach to Quebec to meddle with our secularism legislation and not deal with its own business, like, for example, customs. We saw during the pandemic not long ago how there were endless waits at customs, all sorts of problems. Flights were canceled, sometimes because there weren't enough air controllers. This federal government really seems to struggle to deal with its own business, and then it goes preaching around to others. So my recommendation to the federal government would be, mind your own business. The Honourable Member for New Westminster Burnaby. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciated my colleague's speech. The Customs and Immigration Union, Amnesty International, the Canadian Civil Liberties Union, the Canada Refugees Council, all of these organizations very well respected that I just mentioned, have asked that should be a standard set for handling complaints and how long it takes, especially when it comes to systemic racism complaints. But the government turned down those amendments and refused to bring in resources to help the organization appropriately fulfill its objectives. Would my colleague agree that this is a mistake of the government? That there are many positive aspects, but that things could have been done better? The Honourable Member, very quickly, please. Well, Mr. Speaker, I haven't specifically read the amendments my colleague is referring to. But when it comes to systemic racism, there's an issue which can occur, which is to presume in advance that there is systemic racism or racism. So if there was something in the amendment that automatically assumed that, there might be a problem. For example, in the bill, we see that the Commission needs to report to the government and the public on the type of complaint that is raised on a regular basis. And the RCMP and the CBSA have to report on that. So there will be a way to get an overall view of what's happening and to see whether indeed it's necessary to go further. If, for example, certain problems are raised more often than others, for example, about racism.
The deputy to New Westminster Burnaby in about 6.5 minutes.
And thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And could I ask you if you give me a very clear 1-minute warning as well? I would appreciate that. I'm rising to support, of course, this legislation. Bill C-20 is something that's been needed for some time. And the reality is we've heard from so many stakeholders, the groups that I just cited a few minutes ago, that having an act established in the Public Complaints and Review Commission, amending these acts and statutory instruments is a extremely important and needed improvement to the existing situation. As I mentioned earlier, Mr. Speaker, the fact that the Liberals have not set in place service standards and have not adequately funded this commission is profoundly disturbing. The budget, the proposed budget, is far below what is needed. All the witnesses who appeared before public safety indicated this. So this continues to be a problem. But there is a reality that this bill has been vastly improved through the parliamentary procedure. Now, Mr. Speaker, I mentioned earlier the fact that the Conservatives stalled this legislation for months makes it a bit rich that they're pretending today that they want to see the legislation go through, but I'll be testing that in a few minutes. The reality is report stage amendments normally have to be substantive to be considered. And the fact that we are considering right now deleting the short title, which is a meaningless motion that is only designed to delay the legislation, is something that really saddens me. We know that the legislation is long overdue. It was delayed for months because of filibuster by the Conservatives in public safety. We finally got it through. But it's important to note that 3/4 of the amendments, even at the Public Safety Committee, that Conservatives filed on C-20, they withdrew. So they filed it and then withdrew those amendments. That's not the case for the NDP, Mr. Speaker. What we are, as you know, and you've heard it said before, we're the worker bees in the House of Commons, the adults in the room, and what we did is very diligently went to work to make a number of improvements to the legislation. And that's what I want to focus on for the few minutes that are accorded to me. We did not succeed in forcing the government to put in place service standards. We have not yet succeeded in getting adequate funding for the Commission. But what we did do is through a variety of amendments that were passed and looking through, we're talking about a dozen key areas where the NDP sought and succeeded with the support often of all parties in improving the legislation. First off, the Customs and Immigration Union had serious concerns about the lack of union representation in this act. And that is something that we pushed for and achieved. We now have union representation through the Commission process that is vitally important. Secondly, we wanted to increase transparency and accountability, and that is something that the Breaking Barriers Coalition, which is a coalition of civil liberties associations across Canada, was calling for. We ensured, with a number of amendments, more transparency and accountability in the legislation. There was very little that actually ensured the reconciliation process with Indigenous peoples. That is another. We had a number of amendments that passed that ensured that reconciliation had to be taken into consideration throughout the Commission process. We are proud of that, those series of amendments as well. As I would say, Mr. Speaker, in most cases, what the NDP was proposing is the worker bees in Parliament at the Public Safety Committee. I'm thankful to say, and this shows collaboration from all members, were passed unanimously or often with 3 of the 4 parties around the table supporting. We also wanted to expand the investigative power, including provisions around mental health information. When there is misconduct, it is not just physical medical information, but also often mental health information that can be conclusive. And we were able to get that amendment in as well to improve this legislation. We wanted to make sure, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of transparency and accountability, to ensure that the public is aware of how privileged information is protected within the scope of the Act. That as well, Mr. Speaker, was passed. We wanted to give complainants a longer period to come forward to make a complaint. That is a matter of respect to complainants, and we got that passed as well. We banned the use of non-disclosure agreements to silence victims, and we wanted to make sure that there was no process of intimidation around this, and got that passed as well. We also wanted to make sure that the PCRC had the ability to investigate a complaint related to disciplinary measures taken by the CBSA management, and managed to get that in place as well. Now, Mr. Speaker, all those improvements have meant that this bill is much better, and we need to proceed to third reading. No more delays, and so If you seek it, I believe you will find unanimous consent for the following motion, that notwithstanding any standing order, special order, or usual practice of the House, the motion in amendment at report stage to Bill C-20, an act establishing the Public Complaints and Review Commission and amending certain acts and statutory instruments in the name of the MP for Sturgeon River Parkland, be deemed withdrawn, and Bill C-20, an act establishing the Public Complaints and Review Commission and amending certain acts and statutory instruments, be deemed concurred in at report stage as amended.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
All those opposed to the honourable member moving the motion will please say nay. I'm hearing some nays. Statements by members. The honourable member for Spadina Fort York.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Fayaz Karim, a former NDP candidate for Mississauga-Streetsville, recently posted anti-Semitic comments and personal insults against me on his X account. The posts were disturbing. Among other things, he accused me of being a Zionist whore and a Zionist prostitute. Mr. Speaker, there is no such place. There's no place for such language by this former NDP candidate. Respectable debate and different opinions are fair. This vindictive bile is not. Mr. Karim also attacked British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak for his support of Israel. He wrote that Prime Minister Sunak needed a history lesson on the last 6 months and referred to him as a house coolie. Mr. Speaker, the NDP tries to pass itself off as a party of inclusion and diversity. One wouldn't know it with Mr. Karim in their midst. Is this the type of person the NDP wants in its party? I call upon the NDP leader to denounce these anti-Semitic, racist, and insulting ravings.
The honourable member for Milton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canada's home to a quarter of the Earth's wetlands, temperate rainforests, and boreal forests, 20% of the world's freshwater, and the longest coastline in the world. We've got precious habitats for birds, fish, and mammals. We have a special responsibility to the world, and we're doing our part. It's Nature Week, so I met with organizations focused on our shared commitment to protect and preserve our greatest natural resource. Big thanks to Nature Canada and the Bruce Trail Conservancy for championing the cause of nature conservation. The Bruce Trail Conservancy is securing and conserving Niagara Escarpment lands, including territory in my riding of Milton, with a 5-year, $5 million grant, beautiful new trails in Lowville. Additionally, Parks Canada's contribution of over $3.5 million to Conservation Halton for the Coots to Escarpment Ecosystem Park showcases our dedication to creating interconnected green spaces. Through Budget 2024, we're also investing in Canada's new national parks to preserve them and create 3 new parks in BC, PEI, and Windsor, Ontario. With Canada's pledge to conserve 30% of our lands and waters by 2030, with $2.5 billion in new funding to combat nature loss, Canada remains unwavering in our commitment to safeguarding our precious ecosystems for generations to come.
Bravo. The honourable member for Red Deer Lacombe.
Mr. Speaker, with more Canadians using food banks than ever before and many on the brink of financial ruin, the next election can't come soon enough. That's right. Yet this Prime Minister has insisted on pushing policies that Canadians know are wacko. Handing out needles to prisoners while they're in jail is wacko. Insisting that the budget will balance itself is wacko. Thinking that vitamins and supplements need to be regulated the same as prescription drugs is wacko. Letting repeat offenders out on bail so they can reoffend over and over and over is wacko. Turning a blind eye to foreign interference in our elections is wacko. Letting people smoke meth next to kids in our parks and playgrounds is wacko. After 9 years of wacko policies, Mr. Speaker, it's time for Canadians to switch to a blue Solo cup because the red one's messed up and the orange one's bad luck. Let's bring it home.
The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Rainbow Stage is Canada's largest and longest-running outdoor theatre. It's truly a jewel in the north end of Winnipeg. Mr. Speaker, this year they will be celebrating 70 years, providing incredible world-class entertainment. Starting on June 27, the first of 2 musicals is going to be on stage. Mabuhay, a new musical, Mr. Speaker, which is going to be an amazing show, and I would encourage encourage people that have never witnessed Rainbow Stage to get out and become a part of something absolutely new, and it's going to be entertaining. That's going to be followed by Mary Poppins, something in which we're all very familiar with. This year is special because with Mabuhay, June being Philippine Heritage Month, it's a great opportunity for us to be able to celebrate the 70th year for Rainbow Stage. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I'm just going to make a reminder that we should have our T-shirts, if we're wearing them, underneath our jackets. That would be nice. That would be nice. Underneath.
It's a new MP.
I know. When we're new here, this is what happens. The honourable member for Nunavut.